So my next question is, a lot of a lot of students have been advised to take a diagnostic test before studying for the LSAT just to get a better idea of where they're starting. And I've heard of questions where it's like, if I'm starting in the low 140s or even 130s, is it do I have the potential to, aim for 100 and 160s, 170s? What's sort of your input on that?
Yeah, you certainly can. It just takes a lot of work. And that's a reason I don't typically recommend cold diagnostics. I rarely encounter anybody who's happy with their cold diagnostic having done no prior studying. And I'm curious to hear from both of you if you're willing to share what your initial diagnostic scores were and how things changed over time as you studied more.
Sure, I guess I can go first. The first test that I took on my own, I think I scored roughly, I believe it was a 143, and that was without studying for it. And for the first time, I just wanted to see where my skill set is and what areas I need really improvement. And then afterwards, I took a course and also did a diagnostic test there, scored roughly around the same range. And then I studied, as I said, 8 hours a day, try to improve some of the weaknesses that I was able to identify when taking the practice tests. And over time, just a lot of work and dedication, I was able to improve in certain sections. But the most difficult section for me was the logical reasoning. And there's two sections of that, I believe, in the LSAT, at least before LSAT Flex. And so that was a big sort of obstacle for me because since there are many questions on it, you need to do really well in that section to really get the score that you want or a competitive score. So most of my time went towards improving that section. I was fairly good at logic games and also reading comprehension. Reading comp was because I studied law and society for my undergrad, and I was sort of used to reading a lot of cases and being able to identify arguments, like the structure of the paper, and sort of weaken and strengthen what the authors were arguing in the case. So if you do have a background in reading legal cases or even writing essays, I think reading comprehension might be relatively easier. But in terms of logical reasoning and even logic games wasn't as difficult as logical reasoning, but that was sort of my experience. And over time, as you mentioned, Steve, you have to take roughly 6 months studying for it. I believe I studied after I graduated from undergrad. So I did 4 years of undergrad and I took a year off to study for the LSAT. And within that year, I studied approximately 7 months, I believe. And I also prepared my law school application. So I gave myself enough time to study for it. And eventually I was able to get a score competitive enough to get into Osgoode Hall Law School, which is a law school here in Toronto.
I really appreciate your sharing that, Mustafa, because I think too many people posting online, they only post about their success stories. They only post about the ending point, but they don't feel comfortable oftentimes sharing the starting point. And it's great to hear that you started in the low 140s, yet you were able to successfully get into a great law school. You're there now, you're obviously doing fine, and you can improve significantly. That's the key. So back to Annie's question, can you start in the 130s or 140s and improve significantly? Can you get into the 160s? Can you get into the 170s? You absolutely can. And I'm living proof of at least going from the low 150s to a 175. I've seen many students do the same. It just takes more work than folks initially might think. But like I said at the beginning, this is a harder exam than most, if not all, exams that the typical pre-law student has encountered up to this point. So it just takes more work and it takes more dedicated, focused time blocking it off in your schedule, which is hard to do, especially when you're in college and you've got other obligations that are actually scheduled by default. You've got to carve out time for the LSAT specifically, which requires a bit more deliberation than people might typically do at first.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of times when you actually feel like giving up because it becomes so frustrating when you keep practicing and practicing. And even after like 3 to 4 months, like my score wasn't as improved as I wanted it to be, like starting at around like 143. after like 3 months of practice, I had only improved by 7 points. I was at a 150. And then later on, as I practiced more and took another 4 to 5 months studying for it, eventually, I believe the highest score that I got in terms of practicing was a 168. And once I hit 168, I knew that it's possible to work on it and even improve some of the issues that I had with some of the questions that I wasn't able to answer properly. So once I took the test, the next day I would go over it again and sort of figure out where I did what I did wrong, and sort of learn from your mistakes. And eventually, it's almost like a skill you have to gain, and that takes a long time for someone to master it. So giving yourself plenty of time would be helpful.
Yeah, I want to call out one thing you said, which I think is really important and doesn't get enough attention typically, which is learning from your mistakes, engaging in that in-depth review process. For me, that was the biggest breakthrough when I stopped taking exam after exam and obsessively measuring my results, tracking them on spreadsheets and hoping that something would magically change when, at that point, there were only, I think, 40 something numbered exams. Now there's 89 numbered exams. So there's nearly double available what there was back then. But even still, the default mode that a lot of students take is just taking all the exams in order, maybe starting with exam number 1, maybe starting with whichever random book they happen to have gotten from a friend. But it's not enough to simply take exams. You've got to first learn the theory and the concepts, then apply them, then figure out what you're getting wrong and why. So reviewing everything you get wrong, everything you have difficulty with. And I've been refining what I consider the ideal review process over time, and I'm still experimenting with it and encouraging students in my courses to do the same. But I've distilled the best I've learned up to this point in what I call the Socratic review method, where you analyze, let's say for logical reasoning, the short argument, also known as the stimulus, the question stem, and the answer choices to see exactly where your misunderstanding comes from, reviewing it in depth, even writing out your own explanations, articulating it out loud, not just in your head. Because in your head, it's too easy to say, oh, I get it now, and move on after looking at the answer key. But you've got to slow it down. I'll tell people, bring me the 3 to 5 hardest problems you've recently encountered, and we'll review them in excruciating detail. I had a class last week. We reviewed just one reading count passage, took us an entire hour. We didn't even get to all the questions, just that one passage. It's hard work, but that's the key. And I think a lot of it does relate to law school, reviewing in depth. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.